Today, I am so happy to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Gibson. He is a director of the Centre of Emotional Education, and the topic he is researching deeply into at the moment is shame. Now, I wasn't really aware of shame being an issue for me or my clients until I was in my 30s. And once you're aware of it, as with all things, you see it everywhere. And I see with my clients, looking back with when I was working with colleagues, and just looking at society as a whole, shame is absolutely screwing us over, and we don't even realize it. It is quite often the foundational base layer of what is causing us to self-sabotage. It's showing up through imposter syndrome, and as business owners, it can really scupper our best efforts to create the success and happy life and business that we want. Now, Matthew is an absolute expert in this field, and we could have spoken for hours. I'm pretty sure he's going to be a returning guest because his knowledge on the subject is phenomenal. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode with Dr. Matthew Gibson. Welcome to the Focused and Fearless podcast, the show designed to explore how you can step into powerful self-leadership and stop settling for less in your life, business, health, and wealth. I'm your host, Heather Angel, and as a certified energy practitioner, coach, and online business consultant with over a decade of experience, you can expect expansive, honest, and enlightening conversations about what it really takes to create the changes in your life and business that right now may just feel completely out of reach. Thank you for choosing to invest in yourself by listening to this episode. Without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast. I'm really pleased to have you with us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's going to be such a great conversation. As I mentioned in the intro, you are really an expert. You dive deep into this topic. This isn't just I read a book about shame once and I'll have a chat about it. Like, this is a deep dive into the topic. So I'd love to know what led you from the work you were doing. What sort of really sparked your interest around the topic of shame?
That's interesting in that I started my adult life doing a degree in medical microbiology, and which has got nothing to do with it. And then sort of got to the end of that and just had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And if you don't know what you want to do with your life, you drift about a bit. I drifted about a bit. And so I just, every job that I applied for, I was never really and there was no conviction. So no one was going to really employ somebody who didn't really believe in whatever it was they're doing, except for a job which didn't really have much of a future. And that was where I was at. And so I was invited by a friend to come and to go and spend a week at this place in Derbyshire, which was the Atlow Mill Centre for Emotional Education. And we went to just help them out, really. They were a charity, but they did courses and all sorts of things. All I knew, they worked with people about emotions. I didn't know much about emotions, but it sounded like a good time to go. And when I went, we sort of ended up staying for months and sort of really helping them out. And I did some of their courses, and on their courses, they introduced me to the idea of shame. And I'd never thought about it because you don't. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe people do. I didn't. I'd never thought about it. Never really come up. I'm not even sure I really understood the word. I mean, I knew the word, but I'm not sure I'd ever really used it. And so it really connected with me, and really stuck with me. So the work that I did there pushed me in a direction which gave me some conviction and ideas about who I was and what I wanted to do with my life. And so I then went and trained to be a social worker because I wanted to work with children. And I did my dissertation in emotions, focused on shame, and then I became a practitioner and always an interest in research. And so I continued to read about it, and I I delivered courses, emotional education courses through the mill while I was a social worker. And there was always a bit on shame there. And then when I got a job in academia, I came and started my PhD and started teaching at the University of Birmingham. And my PhD was focused on shame. So it sort of stayed with me right from that moment of being like 21, when I was, just trying to work out what I was doing and who I was. That had really stayed with me to the point where now, like, I was in my 30s and I was like doing a research project on shame. And the focus was, I guess, was other people, but it sort of is always something which you apply to yourself, because it's a universal sort of experience about who are we and how do we relate to other people, and how do we measure up to other people, and what are the standards and expectations that are placed upon us, and where do those come from, and what happens when we don't meet those standards and expectations and we feel like we perhaps are not worthy, or that we're failing somehow, or but we don't have those words, and most people don't sort of put those words to it, and we find ways to distance ourselves or defend ourselves against them. And so we end up in difficult conversations, or we end up in difficult places in our lives. And certainly in my research, I look at the effect of shame in organizations, professional practice, and the impact that has on individuals. And you can really see how it just stops everything working. It stops people getting what they need. It stops them having relationships which feel satisfying. It stops them being able to push themselves in a way which would really match their talents, and so they feel dissatisfied with life and unfulfilled, because they're not actually being able to put themselves out there, because the fear of shame is so difficult. And so we end up in sort of a whole merry-go-round of shame avoidance behaviors. And that's an awful lot of what I see right across the research. And, you start looking at yourself and seeing how you've done that. And that was very much where I was, when I sort of came out of school, out of university. If you don't have language to how you feel, your feelings can end up being the things which are driving your behavior, because you've got no control over them, because you're not really aware of what they are and where that's coming from.
Yeah.
And so I sort of go back to that point of, like, just in many ways, it was just giving me a language, gave me a label to sort of say, this is what you feel. And then it was like, okay, right. Yeah. So I feel like I am not able to live up to these standards which are sort of imposed externally on me. And that is making me feel like I am not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'm not a success, mainly in other people's eyes. And then I'm not willing to try. I don't even have the conviction inside of me to own the things which I actually want to do with my life. And so I put them on the back burner, because if I do them, I might fail. And if I fail, that actually feels worse than actually doing it. And so there's that sort of really, people call it self-sabotaging behavior, and it is, but at the heart of a lot of that is the fear of failure and the sense of shame. In that sense,
that's what's so fascinating about, the reason I wanted to bring you on for the podcast is because you've mentioned a few things which my audience will be so familiar with, because in the self-development world, we've been banged over the head for ages, like, oh, it's because you think you're not worthy, it's because you think you're not enough, do affirmations around that. And but the actual conversation around what's maybe even underneath that, and what you've discussed and what you've discovered, is the word shame. I have only heard people talk about that in very clinical terms, like when people are dealing with really extreme trauma and they're like talking about the shame that's behind it and things like that. I've never really heard it being discussed in the way that you're discussing it, because it makes since we've had our first conversation, I'm like, this makes so much sense. How is this not everywhere? Like, this is just once you see it, you're like, oh my gosh, of course. And I think, what you say about not having that language to express what your emotions are, because you can't label them, because we're just not taught that level of emotional intelligence at a young enough age, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So how are you said also that the fear of failing and its sort of sabotaging behavior. How are you seeing that show up then for, things in your studies? How are you seeing that show up, or how did you see that show up for you when you realize you're like, oh, hang on, it's shame? Like what made you realize like that's the word for it?
Well, I guess, I'm not sure I did realize it as much as it was sort of like this session where someone was teaching about shame, and I was like, hang on a minute, this all sounds incredibly familiar. And it was that sort of realization, then starting looking into it. They talked about toxic shame and healthy shame, and people get into that debate, is there a healthy shame? And I don't know how useful that conversation is. Obviously, if you are shameless, that's a problem. So you might say that there is a healthy shame, but actually you try and define healthy shame and you get into real difficulties. Shame is toxic, but I think it's about the relationship you have with yourself, and it's the relationship you have with the world and other people. And shame is the linchpin that links you and your identity to everything else. And so, if I take a bit of, introduce a little bit of theory to sort of make sense of how this sort of relates, because I think it's a really important point that you make, is that we sort of say shame is out over there, with other people with serious mental health problems or with, serious trauma. That's where shame lies. But actually, if we look at the process of how shame is created, we can understand where we are within all of that. And so Charles Cooley was a theorist, sociologist, psychologist in 1902, and he had the idea about the looking glass self. And what he says is that we develop who we are in relation with other people. And so if you think of having a bunch of mirrors, is that we project who we are onto other people, and other people reflect back to us who we are, what we're good at, what we're not good at, what we are liked for, what we're not liked for, all of these things. And people are telling us all the time. And if you've got kids, you can see it really clearly. You're constantly saying, oh, you like this, or you don't like that, or you're really good at this and you're really good at that. And so we're constantly getting these messages about who we are, but it's not the reality. They are reflections. So the community in which you grow up in is really important about what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior. It's very easy to see that in children, because we say, yes, you can do that. No, you can't do that. There are consequences, etc. But that process is the same no matter where you are or how old you are. And so it's about who defines the boundaries of what is acceptable behavior. And so we get these messages about who we are in the context of what is acceptable. And so we can see not just what an individual might say, yes, acceptable to say whatever it is to me or not. It's about the wider messages about who to be, how to speak, what words to use, all of those things. And those are very much political. So you only need to pick up the newspaper or in a magazine, turn the telly on, whatever, and you see messages about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, what you can do, what you can't do, what are the consequences for stepping over those boundaries. And those are, some are very clear. You will go to prison if you kill someone. Some are much more subtle, like if you say something that someone else thinks is inappropriate, you might get a sly look or whatever. Yeah. But if you get many of those, you start to internalize the idea that you can be a particular way, you might be inappropriate or whatever. And how many of those messages do we need before we then start to have those embedded into us? And those are boundaries which become pushed into the person. And then that person who was born as this worthy, lovable little baby becomes a person with conflict about who I am as a person and who I should be in the eyes of everybody else. Yeah. And now I've got these ideas about how I should be in the eyes of everybody else. I have this conflict about whether I should try to live up to those ideals or try and refine what the ideals are for me about who I am and live up to those. It's rare that those will be the same, because the messages that we get from a societal level are much more, they're caricatures, but women in particular have very, very competing and conflicting messages about how to be. You watch the telly, watch a series on Netflix or wherever, or, look at the newspapers or listen to people's conversations about what it means to be a mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you get these really strange mix of, you should be like this, you should be like that, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And it's a constant sort of message about the way that you should be. And you get that across, men, Brené Brown's work, who's a shame researcher, says that for men, it's about being in a box, and the main box for shame box is about not being weak. So men have a real difficulty with vulnerability, because actually, if you show vulnerability, it's rejected by society, because that's not the way men should be.
Yeah.
And so we all have our particular sort of permutations of what those boundaries are. And we all have a certain level of conflict about how to live up to the standards and expectations that other people have placed on us, and those that we want to for ourselves. But if we follow the ones for ourselves, that's when life feels fulfilling, satisfying. It feels that we are doing something meaningful with our lives. Whereas when we're trying to live up to the ideals and expectations of other people, we might avoid being shamed, because we're not going to get told we are doing something wrong, or that's not the way of doing it. But life can feel empty.
Yeah.
And that emptiness is a sense of sort of manifests itself as anxiety. Like, I'm not doing it. Life should feel different to this. My relationship should feel deeper. I should feel like I can connect with my kids more. I should feel like what I'm doing, my work, is more meaningful, or going to make a bigger difference.
Yeah.
And so, but because we don't have the conversation about who we really are and living up to those things, we have the conversation all the time about how we should live up to everybody else's ideals and society's ideals. And that's the conversation that we have. And so it then feels quite lonely to say, well, who am I, and how do I be me? And then what you get is an awful lot of sort of shaming of that, almost like, oh, it's navel gazing, or it's pointless activity, or whatever it might be. It's a way to defend, because people feel uncomfortable about questioning status quo, when actually to be yourself and to do the things which are really meaningful for you is a threat then to the status quo, which is these certain sets of ideals, standards, rules, and everything else.
Yeah. And I mean, oh my God, there are so many different, as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, there's like so many different rabbit holes we could go down with this. I find that the one thing that screamed out, and I'm sure it probably did with many of my listeners as well, is with the constant overload of information we have with social media as well. I see it all the time with my clients, that they do feel like they've, exactly like you said, they've been put in this box. It's like, right, you are, especially in the online business world, you are a coach, so you must look like this, do this, have these kind of packages, charge these kind of prices. And I've seen it, ruin people's businesses, because they're desperately trying to fit themselves into a business model that they hate. It's not what they want to do. And also, I really, really want to pick up on, because I do talk about women's, empowerment a lot, but I see it with men, and I wonder if this conversation was being had a little bit more out in the open, that actually we wouldn't be seeing such a terrible, terrible situation with men's mental health specifically, because they are in this. I think men are actually going through a very tough time right now, because they've got that sort of message of like, oh, it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to talk about your mental health. But actually, unfortunately, the society we still live in is still showing pictures on magazines like, no, you still got to be a really buff bloke with a six-pack, and that's a man. And you've got to be able to, do DIY, and that's a man. And this is, but oh, it's okay to talk about mental health, but as long as it's in this nice little container, or maybe if you just do it on Instagram or something. I feel like men are in this kind of like, well, Jesus, what am I supposed to, how am I supposed to show up in the world? I'm getting so many conflicting messages.
Yeah, I think certainly for men, I think the message is show your vulnerability in a way that shows that you are in control of it.
Oh my God, yes, that's it. That's spot on. Like, be vulnerable, but make sure it's well packaged, like well packaged vulnerability, please.
Yeah. And then you can put it on, Instagram or wherever, and it's like everyone like goes, oh, that's great, like, look how great this person is to show their vulnerability, but in a way which doesn't threaten anything, doesn't make me feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
When actually vulnerability is often very uncomfortable, because it is a big questioning about some relationship that you have with yourself or other people. And so, if a man does break down and cry in a way which is, actually, I don't know where I'm going with this, I don't know how to feel about this, I don't know what I'm doing, it's very destabilizing for people around them, other men in particular, but other women, because we don't have a sort of cultural conversation about what that means. And so, but if you sort of say, a man is able to sort of express how they feel in a sense of vulnerability, which is very much contained and in control, people can go, yeah, here's a man who's very mature and got it together and he can show his emotions. But it's just another extension, really, of the, don't show that you are weak. It's like, show that you are vulnerable, but in a strong way.
Yes, exactly. It's like, that's exactly it. And I think, I see it, gender aside, I suppose it doesn't really matter how they identify, but I do see it so much. And I've actually had this conversation with my own coach about, like, so sick of having to waste 45 minutes of my day before I go and do a call, because I've got to do my hair and my makeup and I've got to make sure I'm wearing the right thing. And I'm like, oh my God, like, I was like, I'm coming back as a man. I'm going to put a brush through my hair and get on camera and it'll all be great. And she was like, well, why are you doing that? And I'm like, because that's what I'm expected to do.
Exactly, yeah.
It's an expectation. And it's so funny, because I've been doing this work for years, and there's still these layers of conforming that we're not even aware to, because they're so subtle and they've been ingrained in us from such a young age, from, like you said, magazines and media and everything like that. And it's phenomenal how I feel for, I don't know how to word this, but people that aren't in the self-development world, or aren't actually, haven't read a personal development book, and are still, I feel, living in this kind of, like, almost unconsciously in this caged version of themselves, because they're just like, well, I'm miserable. And like you said, anxiety, that's like, okay, well, I feel really awful, I'm not happy with my life, so we'll put anxiety or depression on it, or something like that. And it's because they're just not living their truth at all. They're still so conditioned that they must show up and do this thing and live this way to make sure they've got that social acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what would happen if you'd stopped doing your makeup and your hair and dressing in a particular way is that you then quickly get the social police, who, it might be a look, it might be a comment, it might be, a complaint. You get all of these sorts of things, which are just ways of reinforcing the status quo about, well, this is what a woman should be like. And I think there's a political element to it, and that's part of, I think, is important when personal development stuff is that there was, if we look at where the actual boundaries were installed, the expectations, where they've come from, you can go right back to, like, sort of the Middle Ages, where things like just having a knife and fork, or not, before etiquette, civilized rules came in, people would, spit at the table, or they would sleep in beds together even though they didn't know each other, or they would, all of these sorts of things. And what happened was that the people who had money were then wanted to distance themselves from people who were poor. And so they started to bring in certain rules to differentiate themselves, like you eat with a knife and fork. You don't spit at the table. If you have guests, you give them a separate room in a separate bed. Or if you don't have one, and then there were manuals of etiquette of what you should do in all of these situations, including, you know, how to sleep in a bed with somebody else that you didn't know. So you have these rules which were produced by people with money right across Europe, and they were consumed by people who had money so that they could then demonstrate that they were also of the, you know, the more wealthy classes. Yeah. But because nobody wanted to then be feeling like they were the paupers and, you know, the uncivilized, everybody started doing it. So then the poorer people started using knives and forks and not spitting at the table and whatever else. And so more rules were then imposed about how you spoke, how you dressed, how you behaved, where you go, what sort of things that you liked. And it became this sort of race almost to differentiate themselves, no one wanting to be left behind. But what you see is that the boundaries are defined by those with power and money. And so what's happened is that we see them now, and we don't question whether we use a knife and fork. Certainly in this country, you know, the other countries not so much, but they might have a similar process. But in Europe, you know, we have very defined ideas about the way that a man should be, the way that a woman should be, the way, you know, there's obviously now culturally we have a lot of questions, you know, about gender, and rightly so. I think, you know, we should be questioning these things, and it's a political act almost to say, well, who am I and how do I express who I am so that I can live in accordance with my values and my principles, even though that might be uncomfortable because it challenges an awful lot of assumptions and the status quo of society.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were talking, I was thinking, my gosh, it really does. I mean, that's just the key, isn't it? The rules always come from power and money, and they sort of feed down. And I was thinking it from a business point of view, the amount of conversations I've had with people recently, because I've been banging the drum for people to get out of their heads about this 6-figure business malarkey. Like, it does my nuts. It's everywhere. I'm just like, for a start, 6 figures, I'm like, are we looking at 100,000 or are we looking at 900,000? There's a big difference in how your business is going to be, which one you're going for. But also, I think you get into this bubble when you're in the entrepreneurial space of like, well, that's like the bare minimum. If I'm not making 10K months, 15K months, I'm failing. And then actually, when you look at majority of society, not many are making 10K every month. Like, most people are, you know, on a very, you know, regular kind of salary. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people right now are really struggling. Yet in this entrepreneurial bubble, we see ourselves as failing. It's like, oh, I only made 5K this month. It's like, oh my God, like where have our standards all of a sudden become so up there? Because a handful of online gurus have gone, this is what we should be doing, and if you're a coach, you should have this, that, and the other, and you'll be a millionaire. And it's like, show me how many are actually achieving that. We're trying to get the mass population to be the top 1%, and it's not lighting people up. It's not actually fueling many of my clients' desires to do what they want to do. And I would be interested to know, because I see that this is quite a new thing, like, you know, people trying to aim for things that are not their true desire at all. It's just because they think that's what they should be. You know, you mentioned the word should. Whenever the word should comes up, you're like, oh, hang on a minute, an alarm bell should be going off somewhere.
yeah, absolutely. It's the tyranny of the shoulds. It tells you what the boundaries are that other people have defined for you. Yeah. And, you know, freedom, I mean, I guess one of the reasons why you want to run your own business is to have a level of freedom that allows you to express who you are in the work that you do and make the difference that you can make. And freedom is being able to move away from those rules. But we then have this situation in which you only have to go on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram and whatever, and I'd get plastered with these sort of adverts about, as you say, you know, 6-figure businesses and what model you should use for your business and all this. And you think, and I think, should I be doing that? Oh, how much time is that going to take me to do that? Oh, yeah. I'm never going to be able to get anywhere with the business if, like, I do this, because you have to do what's right for you. But that's hard, you know. And wherever you are, it's hard, isn't it? You define to know who you really are and stand in that position of your values and your ideals, the core self of who you are, is hard, because you've got to find it first of all, and then you've got to define it. And then by doing that, you've got to see what the consequence of that is in relation to your context, which means there will be conflict. And how you manage that conflict, it will be the success of whether you feel fulfilled and your life is meaningful and the relationships you have are satisfying, or whether you sell yourself out to try and live up to these ideals.
And that's exactly where I wanted to ask you about, is because that, we're sort of very aware of that tribe mentality. As humans, we we are ingrained to be part of a tribe. And certainly from my experience, from my clients' experiences, when they do that in a soul searching, it's really uncomfortable, not only for them to sort of be breaking free and kind of thinking, okay, this is actually who I am and this is what I want, but the loss, the actual grief that they go through of going, okay, well, actually, this marriage I'm in isn't ever what I wanted. I did it to conform. Or actually, this house I live in, or the job I do, or the people I'm around, it doesn't happen quickly. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll read a book on shame or self-development and hey presto, I'll know my soul's purpose. It's like, no. I wish it was that
if
quick.
only.
it's that painful sort of breaking away sometimes of, friendship groups and that tribe feeling, that feeling of belonging.
Yeah.
How are you, like, are you seeing that in the research that you're doing? Do you feel that has actually quite a big impact of maybe people dipping their toe into kind of going, oh, hang on a minute, maybe this shame and fear thing is something to investigate, but the consequences are too scary?
Well, I mean, I think for a lot of people, it does feel that, because you don't know what's on the other side. And there's so much invested in the way that things are. I mean, you talk about, the 6-figure business stuff, right? There are people making an awful lot of money in sustaining that sort of cultural script that you should be doing this, because that by trying to achieve that, you make them an awful lot of money. They then get that money to reinvest into sustaining that particular standard as the aim. But if you then, by defining it as like that, it's like you're saying, is if I don't achieve that, I'm failing. I'm not a good entrepreneur. I'm not a good business person. I'm not a good whatever. And so if you go against it, you're sort of saying, well, I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not a business person. I'm not cut out for this because I can't achieve what they've achieved. So, because you've not got the other side. So what's on the other side? If you do the personal development work and you find your own path and you do go along that path, and that is contradictory to received wisdom, it not only is difficult for you, but it challenges everyone else. And you get all these messages saying you shouldn't be doing that. And then you don't know what the end outcome is. You're sort of moving towards this thing that you don't know. And so you have to have an awful lot of conviction. Like leaving a partner or a job. You've set your business up and you sort of want to leave that job, and that's a big jump because you don't know where it's going. But equally the same for yourself. You don't know where you are going by starting that journey and where you're going to end up. And there's an awful lot of people invested in you as the way that you are, and if your partner is invested in you in the way that you have presented yourself, then actually to develop into becoming who you really are and being able to do the things that you really want to do with your life requires someone to love you and be committed to who you are, who you really are, not the mask that you present to try and fit in and live up to the expectations and standards of everybody else. And once you've removed that mask and you be honest, some people will really respond to that. And they're the people, that's you. I mean, that's your tribe. They're the people who are your community, the people who can cope with vulnerability, real vulnerability, the people who can hear the difficult emotions that you experience and can sit with them without trying to fix them, because those can't be fixed. They are things for you to work through because they are indications of the conflict that you have internally. But you need people to communicate that to, because you can't do it on your own. You can't talk to yourself because your mind just will reinvent the way that you currently are. But sometimes when you say it out loud, you often hear it in a different way. And if people can hold that space for you to do that, you can move further and further towards and refine who you really are. And that's about, being brave to know that when you get to that point, when you connect with that, we all know that point when we have those moments in life where we do connect with who we really are, and it feels good. It feels like I really presented myself as the way that I really wanted to. And I felt, even if that was conflict, I stood up to this person that felt good, or I said what I wanted to say to my partner, and that made us feel so much closer. Those are the moments when we're really connecting with ourselves.
Yeah. And that's made me wonder, do you find as people are going through this, is there a connection with shame and blame? Because I can certainly look back at times when I'm like, oh yeah, I had my sort of epiphany of like, I'm not living my full life. It's all your fault. All you other people that, have conditioned me this way. It's society's fault. It's the patriarchy. And then obviously you do get to the point you're like, okay, let's take some personal responsibility now. But do you see a connection with the shame and blame before they even maybe realize that shame's playing a role?
Yeah, absolutely. I referred to Brené Brown's work before. She defines blame as the discharging of pain. And so it's the pain of whatever it might be, that you're not in the place that you want to be, or that you've done something wrong, or that you've not been who you want to be. That's painful. And what shame does, because shame is painful, we find ways to defend against it. And so there are lots of different ways we defend, and blame is one of them. That's the moving against people. We blame other people, and we can even use shame as a weapon. I can shame this other person, because once we're focused on you and what you've done wrong, I don't have to focus on my own shame and what I feel that I have done wrong. But you also get moving away. So I move away from the shame. So I might decide to hide, keep secrets. I might, drink a lot, use drugs, adrenaline seeking behaviors. All of these sorts of things are ways to sort of cover and mask the shame, because once I'm focused on those, I'm no longer having to focus on the actual thing itself. I can, concentrate on this other stuff. But then you can have moving towards the shame, which is that because I feel unworthy through shame, I feel like there is something wrong with me, I can double down on trying to live up to somebody else's expectations and try and appease and please. So, okay, I feel like I'm not good enough to whatever it might be. The way that I can earn that sense of being good enough is just to do whatever someone else tells me to do. And that's a complete selling out of ourselves. But it not only defends us against shame, because you get praised, you get rewarded, you can feel pleased, you can get relationships, but you've completely lost who you are. So yeah, absolutely. Blame is a big one. And there is always, there's always a fine balance. We live in a context in which we have these structures around us. You talk about the patriarchy. It's real, it exists, it imposes certain limits on women's potential. But it doesn't mean that every woman doesn't have an ability to do something to try and fulfill their potential. But it's not in a vacuum. Some of the personal development work that I struggle with is those which sort of say you can do anything and be anything if only you try hard. It's just, for me, that's just instilling shame, because it's like, well, okay, I've tried really hard and I haven't achieved it. What does that mean? Oh, must be something wrong with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point to look at, because I was about to go on to sort of how people can recognize whether maybe shame is something they need to sort of explore, because I think that is true. The personal development world, I think it's amazing, and you know, I'm in it, so it's definitely something I strongly believe in. But I think there's so much nonsense out there. Again, like that whole like people that just believe, oh, you know, as long as I believe it, or you know, I think it's going to happen, it's going to work for me. And so, well, actually, you know, we live in a racist world, a sexist world, a world where actually not everybody on this planet is born with the same opportunities. So, you know, one person in one part of the country or one person in the part of the world could read the same book, and it's like, actually, yeah, great. As a white middle class woman, I totally believe I can do everything, because really there's nothing stopping me. If it was a different situation, if I've been born in a different part of the world, that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, it is a very, it's an area where I think, but actually all goes back to exactly what you were saying at the beginning, that, you know, I sort of talk about it from a slightly woo-woo side of it, but, you know, living our soul's purpose, living our soul's truth. And actually that isn't the same for everybody. Not everyone needs a big business. Not everyone needs a massive house. I've got friends who, since the pandemic, have completely uprooted and changed their lives. And I've got one friend who homeschools her child. They have a camper van and they are so happy. There's very little material things, you know, their life on Instagram, most people are like, nope, not going to do that. But they are the happiest people I know. I'm just like, this is amazing. Not everyone's version of happiness and success is the same. And, you know, I do hope that that's a world we're moving towards, where people can actually go, do you know what? I'm really happy with this version of my life. And I'm really happy with a business that turns over 40K a year. I don't, you know, I have nothing wrong with people aspiring to be whatever they want to be. But from a place of truth, rather than live up to those expectations that, you know, have been imposed on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, that is where you want to be, you know, knowing that. And I think, you know, the pandemic has been one of those things which has really made people question, you know, who am I and how do I live this life? You know, you've got one life and we're being told how to live it by so many different people. And the pandemic sort of made everybody take a pause and go, all right, okay, is this, if we were to die very soon, would we be happy with what we've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's those big life questions that I think have really shaken a lot of people who didn't even know about the self-development world, but just, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way at all, but, you know, regular people doing the 9 to 5, living the life, kind of going, holy shit, is there more to this? There might actually be more. And I think where I'd love to go next, and for people to have some tangible things to work with, is you mentioned before that, you know, the shame's showing up and they're sort of thinking, you know, I'm not enough to do this, or I'm not worthy. So they might people please, and you know, different things might show up. But our minds are so clever, aren't they? We don't, unfortunately, our brain doesn't go, oh, don't worry, love, this is the reason you're feeling this way. It's because you feel you're not worthy. And that's linked to shame. We tell ourselves all other kinds of fabricated versions of events. So what are a few things that might be showing up in people's lives now that you would suggest that they maybe look into shame? Maybe, you know, sort of read up on some of the things that you're doing to help them work through these things.
I mean, I'm a big believer of starting with where you're at. Other people might say, look into your past. And I think I'm a big believer in looking into your past, but I think you've got to start with where you're at. And so, you know, how are you feeling right now in whatever moment you're in, you know, in your relationships, in your work, towards yourself? What are the things that you're telling yourself, you know, paying attention to those. And, you know, the beginning of any sort of shame work is having a focus on how we feel. And certainly the research shows that for those people who have language for their feelings are much more satisfied with life and are able to develop much more meaningful relationships, or feel that they have more deeper and meaningful relationships, because it means that we can express to other people who we are. I work with a psychotherapist, and she calls it the heart space, and being able to communicate your heart space with people who are really comfortable with hearing it and wanting to hear it, And so it's being able to notice how we feel and then be able to put words to those things. That's the beginning. When we also say in our centre that awareness is the booby prize, because being aware of it is perfectly fine, but you can get stuck in awareness. It's sort of not going to do anything. You have to then do something with it. It's the action afterwards, but you can't do anything without the awareness. So, it's obviously important. But if we start to identify, firstly in our bodies, and then in the thoughts, in the words, communicate them to other people and not be worried about communicating them. I mean, that's where shame sort of comes in all sorts of things. If you sit there and say, right, just tell the other person what's going on in your head right now, people edit it. They either don't say it, or they edit it, or they find a way to sort of say it in different ways, rather than it just being the whole unedited whatever is in there at the moment, because we're worried about the judgment and the criticism that might come from actually just being open. But we can't expect other people to know who we really are and therefore know who we really are if we can't do that in the first place. We can't be scared of our own internal feelings, because they're just feelings. They don't tell us anything other than there's something going on, and it's then what we make that mean. So once we're able to identify those, start putting words to them, we start to able to communicate with ourselves and other people in a much more honest way. That is the beginning process. And then we start to say, well, okay, what do we do about it? But a lot of the time things start changing just by doing that. I think, if you just start having conversations about how you're feeling, you'll start knowing who is committed to you, who is committed to who you really are and helping you fulfill your potential and whatever else that you want to do with your life in a way which, or in distinction to those who are committed to you being the way that you have always been. And if that's a relationship and they want you to be the person who always sorts out the kids and always does this and always does that and whatever else, and then you start saying, well, actually I need some time for me and I'm not going to do these things, and you need to start doing some stuff, it's like, that's when you really know whether someone's going to be really committed to you. But then you're being able to know from yourself how you're feeling and be able to communicate that is the starting point to then be able to say, well, why do I feel like that? What is it that's going on in me? And that's where we then need to go into our past, into our history, because we don't see the world the way that it is. We see the world the way that we are. And so we then start to, see criticism where criticism might not be. We might see failure where failure isn't, and all of that. And so where are those messages? Where have they come from? And how have they become embedded into our notions of who we are? And once we start identifying those things, we can then remove them from the defining aspects of who we are. And that, I think, is the beginning process of coming back to and finding, our core self.
Yeah, I completely agree. And are there any tools or ways that you can suggest for people to start finding that language? Because I think it's such a powerful thing that you're saying, like once we can actually express those feelings, because I can imagine people go, okay, I'm feeling this, and the only thing I can say is I just feel shit, like I just feel a bit rubbish. Like it's like, okay, well, we need to find other language here to help other people explain it, because I do find that there are people that will rise up with you and grow with you, and there are people that actually your growth and development is going to shine exactly what you were saying at the very beginning. It almost shines a mirror into them going, how are you living your life? What are you doing? Are you going to ask yourself some of these awkward questions? And they go, nope. No, thank you very much. You can go on that path. I'm off. So how can people start finding that language? Are there any tools or tricks or hints that you can give people?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a funny relationship with tools because they can be really useful, but it's like we almost have an over reliance on the need for tools as much as it is the conversation. The conversation is the tool, it's the mechanism, I think. Once you're in the world of sort of wanting to find out, actually just reading about stuff becomes really powerful because they provide you with that language. But even, you know, some people who read an awful lot of novels, you know, that even that can just be really useful in terms of being able to see how people describe how they feel. I mean, we post up on our website, you know, articles about, you know, different experiences that people might have, provide the language and some ideas about what to do. And that's one way. There's a woman that I think is great called Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a emotions researcher in the States, and she's got a TED talk and she's got a book called How Emotions Are Made. It's a really nice overview of the research on emotions, but also has an awful lot of ideas about how to start naming your emotions. And she, I mean, she's a big advocate of basically just giving it words that you want to give it. She doesn't think that you should just necessarily use the words that, you know, that we've got, like shame, guilt, humiliation, embarrassment, whatever. She just says use the words that are right for you, and just as you start doing that over time, you start becoming much more skilled at being able to communicate what that feeling is and breaking it down into the different points. Most of the time with feelings, it's about your relationship with yourself. You know, I don't feel like I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, live up to whatever standards, or your relationship with other people. You know, I feel like I've let someone down, or someone else has let me down, or whatever. And even just using those basics, you get you quite far with it. But if you, in terms of tools, just taking 10 minutes a day just to notice how you feel. And if you really want to start doing it, then write it down. You know, taking diaries or some kind of journal, or, you know, they can be really helpful to get you to focus on them for a temporary period of time. And that will really help you to develop the language. And that then gives you an indication about where to go next.
Yeah.
You know, if you feel dissatisfied a lot of the time, or you feel, you know, anxious an awful lot, or you feel that, you know, you're not quite able to do what you think you are capable of doing, you know, if this is coming up quite a lot, then these are all indications that there is more. Like you say, you know, there is more to life if we are able to be compassionate with ourselves and courageous with our hearts, you know, which is take the leap, have that difficult conversation, open yourself up to people that you think that you can trust, and it will start changing your relationships. It will start changing your life. And then, you know, hopefully we can be brave in saying, this is what life should look like for me.
I completely agree. And I think, you know, we'll wrap up, because honestly, there are so many, like I said, there are so many directions we could take this conversation. But I do think as well that people need to be aware that the self-development world can be a bit of a rabbit hole. And I'm a big believer you do need to look at your past, because there will be patterns and things going on in there that will give you clues. But equally, the personal development world is also kind of set up to keep you stuck, because then that keeps generating more book sales and more course sales and things like that. So once you've looked at the past, you don't necessarily have to keep rehashing it over and over and over again.
And we've got a book on our website by Jean Bond. I mean, Jean was the person who ran the courses for me when I went to the Atlow Mill Centre in Derby many years ago. And her book's called Behind the Mask, Discovering Your True Self. That's quite useful. I mean, it's another self-development book, but it's quite useful. And what I found different about reading that book was that it sort of gives an awful lot of exercises and doesn't expect you to sort of come back to it. But it does say that you should look at yourself. And that's part of the course that we run, is that there's always an element of knowing yourself. To know yourself, you need to know your past to know your future. But if you don't know your past, then you're going to repeat it. So I guess, I think that's an important point that you make, is that there is a purpose to exploring your past, not an end in and of itself. I think really the biggest tool is other people. Whether you've got a coach, whether you've got a course, books can be useful, articles can be useful, videos can be useful, but they can only take you so far. You really need somebody else to talk through things. And that, I think, is probably how you develop that level of compassion for yourself and other people, and knowing that there is something by taking that leap. Being courageous with your heart means that you can actually get to a different place. It feels different. You feel different. You feel that life is better.
Yeah. Oh, it's been amazing. Honestly, like I said, there are so many things. We probably have to have you back, because I think the whole topic of that sort of fulfilled life, that's ultimately what everyone is looking for. They're looking for that sense of fulfillment and purpose. But I think equally in our search for that, we're tripping ourselves up, because we're like, again, because of all this shame and everything else that's underlying it, going, well, I'm still not there. There's something that we're supposed to be aiming for and constantly striving for, and it's like, actually, are you even aiming for something that you truly want? So it's been an amazing conversation. How can people find the books you're referencing and the articles and things like that?
If they visit our website, which is centereforoemotionaleducation.com, but that's center spelled the English way, CENTRE.
Yeah, great. You had to think that you were hang on it.
Yeah, go on.
Perfect. Well, I'll link that up. And also there's you have your own podcast as well.
Yep, that the Emotional Wisdom podcast. So we are having conversations. I mean, I work, the center is me and Jean Bond, who's been doing it for many years, personal development work, written books, run courses. She's trained as a therapist. Tim, who's a family therapist. Joe, who's a psychotherapist, and Jade, who is a researcher at a different university. So together we sort of bring different skill sets and knowledge bases. And so we have conversations each week to focus on different topics. And we will cover bits of shame, and it comes up every now and again, as much as lots of other emotions. And so if people want to find language and understanding about emotions, then do have a listen.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for giving up your time. I said at the beginning, I was like, this won't be too long, but honestly, there were so many things we could talk about. It's been so valuable. And I really hope people do reach out and go to your website, because there's such a rich amount of information on there, and also written from a slightly different viewpoint as well, because again, in my world, everything can be, people are like, it's your angels, it's your higher self, this is what you need. And I'm like, I'm all up for those conversations, but sometimes we just need a bit of data. We just need some scientific data to go, okay, I'm not crazy, and this is actually, there's a reason behind these feelings and reason why I feel like I'm striving for different things. So thank you so much for sort of sharing your take on shame, and it's been really, really valuable.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me today, and remember, any resources and links mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, I would be so grateful if you would kindly share, subscribe, and leave a positive review so that the podcast can help and reach as many people as possible. Thank you again for listening. Have a gorgeous day, and I'll see you in the next episode.